Open your lexicons to page 9.
The first thing Marin Akafer noticed about the new student was that he was watching the exits. She noticed because she did the same thing every single time she walked into a room. It was a habit she'd picked up 23 years ago, working security at a school in Lagos during a period when working security at a school meant something that kept you awake at night long after you'd left the job. She'd told herself it was a reflex, a scar, something the years had slowly softened into nothing more dangerous than a quirk. Watching the exits, counting heads, noting who had their back to the wall and who had left themselves open. She was 61 years old, retired from 3 careers and 2 continents, and she now taught introductory xenolinguistics at the Vethara Academy of Shared Understanding, one of 6 human educators on a station orbiting a planet she still sometimes couldn't believe was real. Her coffee thermos was dented on one side from a fall she'd taken 2 years ago, and she'd never bothered to replace it. She wore the same worn brown cardigan she'd had since her daughter was born. She had a lesson plan and a headache and 11 students to get through before lunch. The 12th student arrived 4 minutes late. He was Kelvari. That much was immediately clear from the silver banding around his secondary wrists and the slight iridescence at his jaw that marked adulthood in that species. He was young by Kelvari standards, which meant he was somewhere between 40 and 60 years old in Earth terms, and he moved with the particular careful stillness of someone trying very hard not to be noticed, while also being unable to stop noticing everything around him. He took a seat in the back row. He watched the exits. Marin set down her coffee thermos and kept talking about the tonal shift in Vethara ceremonial language between the pre-contact era and the present. She did not look at him again directly, but she watched him in the way she had learned to watch, sideways, through the texture of the room, through the quality of the silence he carried. There were 11 other students in the room. 8 Vethara, 2 Kelvari, 1 human exchange student from New Stockholm named Peter who fell asleep during lectures and woke up somehow knowing everything. None of them were watching the exits. None of them had noticed the new student's hands. Marin had. His hands were wrong. Not obviously wrong, not wrong in a way that would have meant anything to someone who hadn't spent 6 years learning to read the difference between nervous and ready. The Kelvari had 4-fingered hands with joints that bent in 2 directions, and they held things the way humans might loosely hold a cup of water with a kind of contained potential energy. This student's hands were not loose. They were precise, held just slightly too close to his body. Positioned in a way that had nothing to do with sitting in a classroom, and everything to do with what came next. She thought he's here for someone. She finished her sentence about ceremonial tone shifts. She asked Peter a question to wake him up. He startled, answered correctly without missing a beat, and went back to looking like he was asleep. The class laughed softly. The new student in the back row did not laugh. Marin thought, there are 11 students in this room, and one of them is almost certainly a target, and I don't know which one. She thought, I am 61 years old and my knees hurt and I have a lesson plan. She thought, okay. She turned to the board and began writing vocabulary. His name, according to the registration she pulled on her data glass during the break she manufactured 7 minutes into class, was Velorath N. Shavar. He had enrolled that morning. His listed sponsor was a trade consortium that Marin had never heard of, which meant nothing by itself. The academy accepted students from hundreds of organizations. But the registration was clean in a way that felt slightly too clean, the way a hotel room is clean when someone has worked very hard to remove evidence of themselves. She had a contact. She had several contacts, accumulated over years of living on a station where knowing people was how you stayed alive when things went sideways, which they did periodically because the universe was large and complicated, and not everything that moved through a corridor wanted you to make it to lunch. She sent a quiet message to a woman named Thessaly who worked in station security. and who owed Marin a favor from an incident 3 years ago involving a misrouted diplomatic package and a great deal of creative improvisation. The message said, Velorath and Shavar Kelvari enrolled this morning. Can you tell me who he's affiliated with? Thessaly's response came back in 4 minutes. Where did you see him? Marin typed back, he's in my classroom. Thessaly, do not engage. I am sending people. Marin looked at the message. She looked at her classroom. Her 11 students, 12. Counting the problem, were sitting in a loose arc. Some of them working on the written portion of the exercise she'd set. Some talking quietly in pairs. Velorath N. Shavar in the back row was very still and watching a young Vethara student named Kella who sat 2 rows ahead of him and slightly to his left. Kella was 19 years old by Vethara counting, which was roughly 14 in human terms. She was small even by her species standards. She had a habit of chewing the end of her stylus when she was thinking, and she had told Marin once after class that she wanted to study human idiom because she'd heard there was a human phrase. She'd struggled with the pronunciation, it is what it is, and she found it the most philosophically interesting thing any species had ever said. Marin had laughed and said it was mostly just something people said when they were tired. Kella had said, but is that not when philosophy matters most? Marin looked at Velorath looking at Kella. She thought about security arriving. She thought about what security arriving would look like, a disruption, a confrontation, the kind of cornered animal moment that could go very wrong very fast in a small room full of children. She typed back to Thessaly, give me 10 minutes. Thessaly, Marin. 10 minutes she sent back, and she set her data glass face down on her desk. She thought about this carefully, which took approximately 8 seconds, because she was a person who had learned to think carefully and fast as a survival strategy and had spent most of her adult life honing that particular skill. She knew 3 things. First, Velorath was waiting for something, which meant he hadn't moved yet and probably wouldn't move until he judged the moment right, which meant she had a window. Second, she could not create a scene that might precipitate the very thing she was trying to prevent. Third, she was a teacher, and there were things a teacher could do in a classroom that nothing else in the universe could do with the same cover, the same naturalness, the same complete and absolute permission to approach anyone. She picked up her coffee thermos. She walked to the back of the room. She did this slowly, the way she always moved through her classroom during exercises. She was a pacer, her students knew it. It was normal, it was nothing, pausing once to look over Pieter's work and make a small correction, pausing again to answer a quiet question from one of the Vethara students near the middle. She reached the back row. She sat down in the empty seat beside Velorath and Shavar. He went very still, not the stillness of being calm, the stillness of recalculation. She set her coffee thermos on the desk between them with the particular firm thud of someone who had made a decision and was comfortable with it. She didn't look at him. She looked at the front of the room as if she were simply taking a moment to observe her class from a different angle, which was something she did occasionally and her students had learned to find mildly amusing. She said quietly, conversationally, in Kelvari Standard, which she spoke at an intermediate level and had been working on for 3 years. The girl you're watching, she's mine. Oh, silence. She said, not mine in the possessive sense, my student, my responsibility. She turned the thermos in her hands, the dented side catching the light. I have been doing this job for 4 years on this station and 9 years before that on 2 other stations and 23 years before that in various forms of work that taught me to notice things. I noticed you. Velorath said nothing. I've sent a message, she said. Station security will be here in approximately 8 minutes. I imagine you know what that means for however this was supposed to go. She looked at the thermos. I'm not trying to threaten you, I'm trying to give you a moment to think. His voice, when it came, was low and controlled. Kelvari voices had a slight harmonic quality at the edges that human ears perceived as a soft overtone, like a second sound underneath the first. You should not have sat down here. Probably not, she agreed. I am Velorath en Shavar of House Kethamer. What I am here to do is sanctioned under the Kelvari Compact of. I know what the compact says, she interrupted gently. I also know that you're in a room with 11 students who have nothing to do with whatever Kella's family did or didn't do, and that if this goes badly in the next 8 minutes, some of those 11 students are going to spend the rest of their lives carrying it. She paused. I don't think you want that. Another silence, longer. You cannot know what I want, he said. No, she agreed, but I can know what you're doing with your hands. He looked down, he looked up at her. For the first time since he'd entered the room, something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but something more like the face a person makes when a do. Are they were certain was locked turns out to have been open the whole time. What are you, he said. When she thought about it, she picked up her thermos. Tired, she said, and here. Security arrived in 6 minutes, not 8. Thessaly had apparently not listened to her, which Marin chose to interpret as caring rather than insubordination. There were 4 of them, Vethara stationed security in their pale gray uniforms, and they entered with the professional quietness of people who had done this before, and they took Velorath without incident, without a scene, with a minimum of disruption to the class. Most of the students barely looked up. Kella looked up. She watched Velorath being guided out, and then she looked at Marin, who had returned to the front of the room and was writing more vocabulary on the board with the calm efficiency of someone who had a lesson plan to get through. Kella said nothing, she wrote down the vocabulary. After class, she stayed behind. This was not unusual. Kella often stayed behind. She was the kind of student who treated the end of class as the beginning of the real conversation. Marin was cleaning up her things. She did not make a production of waiting. She simply moved through the ordinary ritual of end of day, capping pens, stacking data pads, screwing the lid back on her thermos even though it was empty. Kella said he was from House Kethamer. Oh yes. My family has there is a Kelvari word Velsha. It means something like a debt of blood but also like a wound that must be answered. There is a Velsha between my family and House Kethamer. It is very old. I know, Marin said. She had read up on it quickly during the break she'd manufactured. The dispute went back 60 years, a trade agreement, a death, a counter-death, a chain of obligation that had become more complicated with each generation because that was what obligations did when people weren't careful. It's not my business. Akala said you made it your business. You were in my classrooms. The young Vethara was quiet for a moment. Her species had large, dark eyes with no visible whites, and they were very good at certain kinds of expressions and very bad at others. The expression she was making now was one Marin had learned slowly to read as something between gratitude and the particular distress of realizing that the universe had just bent itself into a shape you didn't know how to process. On my world, Kella said, there is a we do not have a word for what you did. We have a word for interference on behalf of bloodkin. We have a word for obligation to your superior. We have a word for defense of your territory. We do not have a word for, she paused, struggling. For a person who is none of these things, who has no Velsha, no blood, no territory, who simply... Oh, she stopped. Marin waited. Stays, Kella said finally. It was clearly not the right word. Her hands moved slightly in the gesture that Marin had learned meant frustrated inadequacy at the limits of language. Who simply stays. Marin considered this. We have a few words for it, she said. None of them quite cover it either. The consequences took 3 weeks to fully unfold, which was faster than these things usually moved through Kelvari diplomatic channels and slower than Thessaly would have liked. Velorath en Shavar was held by station security while communications bounced between the Academy, the Kelvari Consulate, House Kethamer's legal structure, and 2 different treaty offices that had opinions about what the compact meant in an educational setting. Marin was interviewed 4 times. She answered the same questions the same way each time, clearly and without drama, the way she had learned to give testimony from a career that had required it more than once. She explained what she had observed. She explained what she had done. She declined, politely but firmly, to characterize it as brave or significant or remarkable in any way. The second interviewer, a Kelvari legal arbiter named Sarona, whose face Marin couldn't read and whose voice was very precise, said to her during their session, "You placed yourself between a sanctioned compact agent and his contract. You understand that under Kelvari law, your action constitutes a Velsha claim." Marin said, "I'm sorry, I don't think I understand what that means for me specifically." Sarona said, "It means that by interposing yourself, you have, under our legal tradition, assumed partial responsibility for the ongoing dispute between House Kethamer and the Velathi line." A pause. "This was not a small thing you did, educator Akafer." "I had 11 students in that room," Marin said, 12 counting him. Sarona was quiet for a moment. "Then you counted him." "He was in my room." Another silence. Sarona's precise voice, when it came back, had something different in it, not warmth exactly, but the careful sound of a person encountering a concept for which they have no good container. Under Kelvari tradition, a Velsha can be formally discharged. House Kethamer, in light of certain considerations, has agreed to accept a discharge. This would release you from the implications of your action. "That's fine," Marin said, "whatever's easiest." The discharge requires a formal acknowledgement from House Kethamer that the claim was interfered with by a party acting outside the compact's jurisdiction. "Okay." "In their tradition," Sarona said carefully, "this acknowledgement carries significant weight. It is not a concession they make lightly. Their statement includes," another pause, the quality of this one was different, almost careful. "Their statement includes the phrase Veloraketh, which translates approximately as the debt we did not earn. It is used to describe something given freely without obligation that creates a moral remainder." She paused again. "We do not have many words for it in our language either." Marin thought about Kella saying, "We do not have a word for a person who simply stays." "Oh," she said, "I see." House Kethamer is somewhat without precedent, asking that the discharge be witnessed. They are asking that the name of the person who interfered be recorded in their house records. Sarona's voice was professionally neutral. It was doing a great deal of work. This is how they honor something they do not have a word for. Marin was quiet. "They want to write down my name," she said. "Oh yes, my full name." "Marin Adiz Akafer," Sarona said, "if you consent." Marin looked at her dented coffee thermos sitting on the table between them. She thought about a school in Lagos a long time ago and the particular weight of certain kinds of work. She thought about the way Kella had reached for a word and come up empty. She thought about Velorath's hands and the 8 seconds she had taken to decide, and the way the decision had not felt like courage because it had not felt like anything except the only possible next step. "Oh," she said, "that's fine." Velorath N. Shavar was released from station security after 17 days, under terms that Marin did not fully understand and did not need to. The Velsha between House Kethamer and the Velathi line was placed into formal arbitration, a process that could take years, but that at least meant people stopped trying to act on it in classrooms. Kella returned to class the following Monday. She sat in her usual seat. She chewed the end of her stylus during the lesson. She did not mention what had happened. Marin did not mention it either. This was by unspoken agreement, the kind that forms between two people who understand each other's need to simply be ordinary again. 3 weeks after the incident, Marin came in to find something on her desk. It was a small object, a Vethara memory stone, which was a cultural artifact of the kind her students sometimes used for personal notes, carved from the particular dark blue mineral that the Vethara used to mark significant things. This one had been carved by hand, which she could tell from the slight irregularity of the lines. It was the size of a large coin. It was warm from sitting in the morning light. She turned it over. On the flat side, in careful Vethara script, the formal version, the kind used for things that were meant to last, were 3 words she had to look up, because they were not in the standard curriculum. Velathas Orin. She looked them up. The closest translation was, one who stands in the space between. It was not quite right, she suspected. It was never quite right. But she sat with it for a moment in the empty classroom before the students arrived, the stone warm in her hand, and she thought it was probably as close as language could get. She set it next to her thermos. She got out her lesson plans. When Kella came in 5 minutes later with 3 other students, talking too fast about something she was excited about, Marin was already writing on the board and didn't look up. But she was smiling. Thank you for listening to the end. If this story sat with you, if some part of it stayed in your chest a little longer than you expected, then you already know why I make these. There are so many stories still to tell about what happens when something as strange and stubborn and ordinary as a human being walks into a universe that doesn't quite have words for them yet. If you want to hear more, subscribe. I put out a new story every week, and I read every single comment. You're the reason the light stays on. I'll see you in the next one.